A strange man hunted me through a national park. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. It's not really an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something, open my tent, and there is a guy sitting where my fire had been, which was right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude, sitting there a couple of feet away from my tent. They had no bag, no gear, or anything with them. It was just a guy. He saw me open the tent, and his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and that guy was probably high or something and set up camp not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and about 10 to 15 miles away, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were coming from a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness, someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking right out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away." And me, being kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being extremely freaked out by them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me about 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as fast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped after probably only 100 to 200 feet. But this one couldn't just be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided to end my trip early first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw them off my trail, and occasionally hiding and taking cover, waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to plan out my pathing and next moves to avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, 2 times I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first, but slowly began to realize it sounded more like a human mimicking animal calls. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days those were. Came this close to being murdered while camping. I'm now a 25-year-old woman, but at the time, I was 16 or 17. My then boyfriend and 2 of our other friends decided to go camping in a small patch of woods next to a neighborhood that was being developed. This small patch of woods was roughly 900 feet across both ways. There were no people living in the houses. It was pretty deserted. So, we get our tent, fire pit, chairs, etc., and set up. We're relaxing as it starts to get dark. Then, we hear extremely loud screaming coming from a woman in the distance. At first, there weren't any words we could make out, but then there was a help and a no, and then the loudest, most terrifying scream was cut off part way. We can't see through these trees. They're thick. It's also getting darker, so we immediately get out of there, leaving all of our stuff behind. As we're walking back to the undeveloped neighborhood where we parked, I call the police. While trying to explain the situation, they were trying to tell me it was just a cat in heat From where we parked, we were facing the woods. We see a man come out, dragging something in what looked like heavy sheets. He spots us and starts coming towards our car. Luckily at that moment, the police pulled in. The man ran and, as it turned out, he had killed a woman about 400 feet from where we were camping. Something bad happened while I was camping. I'm just not sure what. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. So, before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag, which was on the far side of the tent away from the opening. My boyfriend at the time slept by the opening with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown with food scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We just stood there for a minute in silence, taking everything in, standing in disbelief. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong. My boyfriend accused me of not locking the door the night before and that an animal got in our stuff. I promised that I locked the door and went into the tent to grab my keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left, but my boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home, and he told me that he had a dream the night before about someone kneeling over him inside the tent, holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it, and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in those woods that night.